Welcome, everybody. My name is Massimo Tomasoli. I'm the Permanent Observer for International IDEA to the United Nations. And we have today the opportunity to spend an hour together with some lead researchers on the quality of democracy at this event co-hosted by International IDEA and the permanent mission of Sweden to the United Nations. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to give the floor for some opening remarks to Ambassador Charlotta Schleiter, Economic and Social Affairs from the Permanent Mission of Sweden to the United Nations. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Massimo. I'm glad to be here. I will not speak for long so that we can move to hearing about these reports, but I just want to reflect on how incredibly timely this is. And as you've also noted in your invitations, this takes place against the backdrop of what we're now witnessing in Ukraine with the Russian aggression against the country. We also are still in a pandemic. I mean, depending on where you are, we say that we're leaving the pandemic or we're leaving it behind us or post-pandemic, but we have to remember that a lot of countries around the world are still in the pandemic very much. And we hear this also from various parts of the UN, who note how much their work is still affected by trying to support countries and also their operations. So it's very important to hear from IDEA and from V-Dem. And we're of course really proud that both these are based in Sweden. A few years back, Sweden moved into a stronger drive on democracy issues, the drive for democracy, precisely because it was obvious that, I mean, there was a backsliding that we were witnessing, and also what it seemed to have the potential to cause. So really happy to be here. I also want to mention how glad I am to see Ulrika here, because this is, I mean, obviously Sweden is a big supporter of UNDP, and UNDP really does bring the assistance that countries often request on institutions, on governance, and so we see that as a really, for us, instrumental support to assistance to countries worldwide. And then also to just reflect on the UN and the conversations in the UN. I mean, obviously very much is around Ukraine and what's happening there, but also around a lot of other crises that it's important for us not to forget or in any way put aside. And I'm not going to name any in particular, but I mean, I could also say that for Sweden, Yemen, we're focusing a lot on Yemen, we're focusing a lot on Afghanistan, we're focusing a lot on other issues as well. And democracy and good governance always come to the forefront on you know what's possible and what's required. We'll see this in the food crisis, which has been caused as a result of the invasion. I also wanted to mention briefly going in a sustainable and greener direction. I don't think that the climate crisis has in any way moved to a backseat. It's as important as ever. And we're going to have a meeting in Stockholm in early June, Stockholm Plus 50, and we'll be talking about those issues, but we'll also be talking about inclusion, not least civil society inclusion of young people. And we're really happy to see that a lot of civil society organizations have registered to be part of the discussions in Stockholm. So that's also something that we're looking forward to, that's coming very soon, and we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about democracy-related issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for having set the tone for today's meeting. And you have already started to introduce some of the speakers. And thank you also for referring to the multiple crises, which are actually polarizing debates at the UN and elsewhere, and within which our conversation today takes place. So the panelists will be Staffan Lindberg, director of the V-Dem Institute, Department of Political Science at the University of Göteborg, and Seema Shah, who is my colleague, head of democracy assessment at International IDEA. And the discussant will be Ulrika Moder, Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP. And I wish to really thank all of you for your availability in addressing today's topic. The panel will present the results of two research efforts. One is the well-known annual report produced by V-Dem on democracy, which this year is entitled Authorization Changing Nature, with a question mark. And the second report is the Global State of Democracy in Focus report, taking stock after 2 years of COVID-19. I'll give the floor now to Professor Lindberg. Staffan?
Thank you so much, Massimo, and thank you to IDEA and the Swedish Mission for organizing this event and inviting me to be part of it. I'll spend a few minutes here talking about this democracy report, this year's democracy report. It has 3 parts. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things from each part. The first part about the state of democracy worldwide in 2021. By our calculations, we are now back to 1989 levels of democracy worldwide. And 70% of the world population now live in autocracies. And that's a radical shift from only 10 years ago, as you can see. Here's the evidence for that. This is our liberal democracy index. In the middle, you have the world average in black, and then the different regions. And you can see the steep downward trend for all regions in the world and for the world as a whole. In fact, but this is our liberal democracy index weighted by population size, because democracy is ruled by the people. So we think it matters how many people are affected by a certain level of democracy. You see the red line here in the middle. If we draw back today's level, it goes all the way back to around 1989. So on a global level, that entire explosion almost of civil liberties, of political rights and freedoms that the world enjoyed after the end of the Cold War has been eradicated. So I think that puts things in perspective, what this period is meaning. So we also see dictatorships on the rise. Let me show you the evidence for that. So here is the same underlying data and going back to 1971, and the red line of closed autocracies were declining for a long, long while, down to 20 at a point. Now have been going up, especially in the last couple of years, up to 30. And electoral autocracies, those that hold multi-party elections but don't have freedoms enough to classify as a democracy, is the most common regime type in the world. Together, they host 70% of the world population. We go to the second part. So let's look at what's changing right now and not just the state of things. We record a record for the past 50 years, a record of 33 countries autocratizing, that the opposite to democratizing, right? Let's look at the evidence for that. Here is again from 1971, the blue line there, the number of countries each year, looking 10 years back, that were democratizing. At the height of the third wave of democratization in the late 1990s, 72 countries at the same time moving forward on democracy. And that number has then slumped down to 15 as our last count. Then they host only 3.4% of the world population. Meanwhile, the number of countries autocratizing since the end of the 1990s have been going up, starting with Russia and then in Venezuela under Chavez, and then increasing, and especially now towards the end of the time series here, up to 33 countries by our count at the end of 2021. This is really serious for democracy because we've looked at this scientific publication and looked at all episodes of autocratization starting in democracies since 1900 across the world. And almost 80% of them die, lead to a breakdown. So just the statistical probability here is that these countries will survive is very low. And to give you an idea of how now all aspects of different varieties of democracy are affected, here a graph showing comparing the number of countries advancing on democracy and declining on democracy on a number of components: clean elections, freedom of expression, deliberation, and so on. In 2011, all of these were above this diagonal line. That means they improved in many more countries than they declined. Compare this, just look at this visual compared to 2021. Boom. All are below the line. That gives you an idea. And worst of all, freedom of expression, where you also have freedom of the media. Who are the major autocratizers then? Here they are, the top 10. Brazil, Mauritius, Poland, Hungary, India, Benin, Serbia, El Salvador, Mali, and Turkey. All of these countries 10 years ago, we classified as democracies, one of either liberal or at least electoral democracies. By 2021, 7 out of the 10 are now autocracies. So also in this period, it seems to have the same relationship. If you start to autocratize as a democracy, the probability you end up as an autocracy is very high. Now, EU is also facing its own wave of autocratizations. We have 6 out of 27, 20% are autocratizing. And here they are. We know about Hungary and Poland. That's been going on for a long time. And we no longer classify Hungary as a democracy. But recently, Slovenia, with quite substantial autocratization, to a much lesser degree, but still for our purposes is statistically significant in Croatia, Czech Republic, and Greece. And then we have the neighbors on the eastern flank. So this is really worrying to us. So that's sort of the main point from the second part of the report. Now, we think autocratization is changing nature, not only what I just showed, but also some other indications. There was a year of coups. The UN Secretary General called this an epidemic of coups, 6, 5 military coups, and then the self-coup in Tunisia. There's a radical change from the last 20 years. And we think this is signifying that autocrats and wannabe autocrats are becoming emboldened, taking more decisive actions and caring less about what the international community thinks. We also see the wave of polarization spreading across the world and reaching toxic levels, where my group is feeling threatened by other groups and the other groups don't have legitimacy. You start to question whether they are a threat to the nation or to our way of life and that sort of thing. And we know what that leads to in the extreme cases. Look at this picture just to give a sort of a visual of this. If you're above the line here, these are countries where polarization has increased substantially and statistically significant in the last 10 years. And in the upper third there, it's all toxic levels. And very few countries below that line. And this is closely related to autocratization. So here you have 5 of the top autocratizing countries and 3 indicators of polarization. They all go up, and in conjunction or shortly after, the liberal democracy index goes down. And we see this pattern across the world. So it's not just these 5 countries that are cherry-picked. These are just illustrations of what is a very general trend. We also have misinformation, and this is no news to nobody here probably, but we think it's also a signal of emboldened autocrats that try to sort of use misinformation and disinformation for their purposes, both at home and abroad. Here is just one indicator of many that we have on this, showing the world average again in the different regions, and increasing across all of them and quite substantially over this time period. Misinformation is being used strategically, as we know, to further interests of autocrats. I've said now several times, and I'll say it again, democracy dies with the lies. Democracy and accountability cannot live in a world where political leaders can say, I didn't say that when they did it, I didn't do that, or what I did was this instead of that, and lie. Then that whole chain of accountability from citizens to leaders completely break down. So this is a fundamental threat to democracy and freedom in the world. So that's the highlights from the third part of the report, democracy, the Democracy Report 2022. And I just want to take 2 minutes with your permission, Massimo, to also say, point to the work we've done under the case for democracy with support from the European Union. There are now several areas where we've gathered the evidence that's out there, rigorous studies from the scientific community showing the dividends for democracy, and by implication what this wave of autocratization will mean. I'm just going to show a couple of the examples. Economic growth. Democracies are better at economic growth, and they are better at avoiding economic disasters. These are very rigorous studies with the longest time series and all the statistical bells and whistles you can think of, and there are many more studies here. There's no doubt that autocratization will mean slower economic growth, and more economic crises, and that's terrible for human development. Democracies are also better at human development. Life expectancy, infant mortality, go down the line. Going from a worst, on average, the worst autocracy to the sort of a good democracy reduces infant mortality by 94%. That's substantial. So autocratization will lead to more higher infant mortality, among other things. Also with climate change, democracies are better at making commitments for the Paris Accord, corresponding to a change in 1.6 degrees globally in climate change. That's substantial. They're also better at implementing these policies. And finally, I just want to show this, given what's going on in the world. Democracies don't fight wars with each other. Evidence is 100% clear. This is like the closest we come to a law in social science, building on Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory. The risk of India engaging with an armed conflict with Pakistan has increased by 300% over the last decade as a result of autocratization in India. Here is where Russia has moved under Putin. On the scale there, on the horizontal scale for sort of democracy, and then the slope is the predicted risk of engaging in an armed conflict. And you can see it's moved from a very low level to a very high level. And from this perspective, the invasion of Ukraine, a democracy, by the way, is not a surprise. Autocratization will lead to more armed conflicts in the world. We know that. All of this is also in our policy briefs that you can access on the website. We have policy briefs on all these areas, and you're welcome to visit the website. And with that, I say thank you, Massimo, and thank you, the Swedish Mission, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much, Staffan. Needless to say, V-Dem is a partner of International IDEA, and we value very much this collaboration. And now the next presentation will actually complement some of these analyses by using a different set of data. And my colleague, Dr. Seema Shah, will present the results of an initiative that we have been carrying out over the last 2 years in connection with the pandemic that was mentioned by the ambassador in her opening remarks. So how has the pandemic impacted on democracy and human rights? Seema, you have the floor. Seema?
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the chance to share the findings from our latest report, which provides an overview of what our data from the Global Monitor of COVID-19's impact on democracy and human rights tells us from 2 years of government responses to the pandemic. When we started writing this report, we were quite optimistic that the worst of the virus was behind us and that much, though not all, of the world was better prepared and more equipped to deal with future surges and variants. As vaccines have developed and spread around the world, it is definitely true that we are at a much better point than we were 2 years ago. On the other hand, as we now seem to be in yet another wave with yet another variant, and as countries take very different paths forward, it is clear that there are still lessons to be learned and important reflections to engage in. We hope that the findings here will spark some thinking and discussion about what the future of life with COVID-19 might look like, and what we need to do to make sure that we uphold rigorous standards of democracy and human rights, even in the midst of crises. At International IDEA, we understand democracy as a broad concept and one that can have very many different manifestations depending on a particular society's history, culture, and set of priorities. Although there are core tenets of democracy, the way these are operationalized can look very different. There is no such thing as a perfect democracy. Overall, we measure the extent to which a country has realized various aspects of democratic ideals along 5 attributes which we consider to be integral to democratic growth. These are representative government, fundamental rights, checks on government, impartial administration, and participatory engagement. As you can see, each of these attributes has a number of sub-attributes and then a number of individual indicators going along with those, ultimately measuring 116 separate questions. Our global monitor tracked developments under each of these attributes. A global monitor was a qualitative monitor of the democracy and human rights implications of measures adopted by governments around the world in the context of COVID-19, specifically in the 165 countries that are included in International IDEA's Global State of Democracy indices. The monitor was updated every 2 weeks at the country level from June 2020 through February 2022. And now for the findings. First, what legal measures did governments put in place to be able to make the quick decisions necessary during a pandemic? What we found was that in broad terms, 59% of the countries we covered invoked a state of legal exception of some kind. This includes constitutional states of emergency, but also includes other types of emergencies like state of pandemic or public health emergency. While we might have expected democracies, especially high-performing ones, to institute some kind of legal state of exception to deal with the pandemic, our data show that it was actually mid-range and weak democracies, along with hybrid regimes, that most often invoked an SOE. High-performing democracies appear to have had the capacity to legislate their way through the crisis, while in authoritarian regimes, declarations of emergency were not needed for the government to take extreme steps. Second, there was regional variation in the use of SOEs. In purple, you can see the breakdown of how many democracies, hybrids, and authoritarian regimes issued emergency legal responses per region. You can see here that the Americas region used them at a very high rate compared to other regions. One example worth noting is that of Botswana. For only the second time since it gained independence, Botswana invoked a constitutional state of emergency at the end of March 2020. Taking note of the national historical significance of the moment and the objections of the opposition parties, the deliberations in parliament were televised to the whole nation. The state of emergency was renewed by the parliament at 6-month intervals until being allowed to expire in September of 2021. While it may seem like the long duration of the SOE is concerning, the conformity with constitutional requirements and care with which the process was treated are both very good examples. A few months after the state of emergency ended, Botswana's Auditor General found the measures to be taken justified and recommended legislative changes that could lead to better legal arrangements in future crises. Third, our data show some important temporal variation. Here you can see the number of COVID cases in the black line compared to the number of countries with an SOE in the colored bands. While the number of cases was quite low in the first wave of the pandemic, the number of emergencies declared during this time was the highest. As of March 2022, 20% of countries have kept the first state of emergency in force, and another 44% have renewed or reintroduced a state of emergency. Going forward, we'll be looking out for a few things. In countries with high levels of vaccination, we will watch for unnecessary extensions to any state of legal exception. We would be watching for extraordinary powers that have been granted to the executive branch to be rescinded. While the pandemic remains an ongoing concern in many countries of the South where vaccination rates are relatively low, there could be justification to continue states of legal exception. At the same time, we know more about the virus now than we did 2 years ago, as countries have demonstrated the possibility of holding elections, court hearings, and legislative assemblies despite the virus. Any further delays in such necessary parts of democratic government must be carefully scrutinized. Looking back, it seems unsurprising that certain civil liberties were restricted during the pandemic. Here you can see the regional breakdown of the use of lockdowns in dark blue, restrictions on the freedom of assembly in light blue, the use of the military in enforcement of the rules in pink, and the use of excessive police force in purple. Our data show that freedom of movement and freedom of association and assembly are the rights that have been the most impacted by government responses. 98% of countries in the world implemented freedom of association restrictions at some point. At least 89% of countries introduced a lockdown, and 52% reinstated lockdowns during later waves. We documented measures of concern in 22 countries, 6 of which also had concerning developments regarding freedom of movement. This graph illustrates the regional breakdown of particular restrictions on the freedom of movement. All countries in the world placed some form of restriction on the freedom of movement during the pandemic. The Global Monitor indicates that at least 86% of countries introduced border closures, despite the fact that evidence for whether or not such closures reduce transmission is disputed. One negative effect of these kinds of restrictions, especially lockdowns, is that they did a poor job of considering the structural challenges faced by developing countries. For example, in Latin America, 80% of individuals in the bottom quintile of the population work in the informal sector. Similarly, 81% of jobs in Africa are in the informal sector. An illustrative case is that of Mexico, where the informal economy accounts for about 55% of the labor force. When a national lockdown was introduced in March 2020, Mexico City's informal commerce was banned and established businesses were closed. This created widespread discontent, who in desperation took to the streets. After lockdown measures were prolonged later that year, hundreds of formal and informal establishments across Mexico City reopened in a show of defiance in January 2021. This was a response to the government's ban and a petition for asking for the government to reconsider restaurants to be included on the list of essential activities. In mid-January 2021, the local government of Mexico City reconsidered the inclusion of restaurants in the list of essential activities as demanded. Going forward, we'll be watching for a couple of things. While the justifiability of restrictions on the rights to freedom of assembly and association will of course vary depending on the country, our current understanding of the virus makes restrictions much harder to justify now than they were in 2020. We know the virus is unlikely to spread in outdoor settings, and this makes any outright ban on outdoor gatherings exceedingly difficult to justify. While the overall vaccination rate is an important factor in determining the risk level of these events, our understanding of how the virus spreads outdoors suggests that masked and spaced protesters or crowds present very low risk for virus transmission. We would therefore treat restrictions on freedom of assembly and association outdoors as highly suspect. When the pandemic arrived in the early days of 2020, media integrity and freedom of expression were already in crisis in most of the world. The crisis was rooted in two separate but interconnected phenomena. One, a business model that did not allow traditional media to compete with the rise of digital access. And two, unregulated social media, which allowed for the rapid spread of propaganda and mis- and disinformation. In several countries, responses to the pandemic exacerbated and deepened the crisis, with corresponding declines in freedom of expression and media integrity. Before the pandemic, only 34 countries were classified as high-performing in these two categories. The virus presented a perfect window of opportunity to accelerate the erosion of these rights. Since the beginning of the pandemic, a total of 93 countries have registered concerning developments related to both freedom of expression or media integrity. In this graph, you can see how high-performing democracies did with regard to freedom of expression. You can see that the declines were much more common than the advances. Over the course of the pandemic, freedom of expression declined as a result of three interrelated phenomena. One, the wave of repression on journalism. Two, a flood of pandemic-related disinformation continues to be a problem today. And three, an increase in legislative changes that entrench restrictions on freedom of expression, especially online. What we will watch going forward include things like new regulations that widen the repression toolkit of authoritarian and hybrid regimes, especially online. Second, many of these laws require private service providers to actually become the implementing arms of a repressive apparatus. Third, overarching measures might further compromise a free, unified, and open internet. And finally, the pandemic has left profound scars on the media infrastructure, both in the shape of new legislation, but also in increased repression and economic hardship. Next, here you can see the state of gender equality by region. You will notice that even the highest scoring region is on the lower end of what we would call high performing. The most well-known impacts of the pandemic on women include an increase in violence, higher rates of unemployment, and a long-term loss of education opportunities. While data on the pandemic's impact on gender-based political violence is still limited, the increased vulnerability of women human rights defenders, for example, imply heightened gender risks and violence in the political sphere. It is also clear that in many countries and contexts, women and other marginalized groups have lower vaccination rates, and that these groups are underrepresented in a systematic way in the decision-making bodies that determine the response to and the recovery from the pandemic. The pandemic also exposed racial and ethnic minorities to increased xenophobia and racism. In countries as diverse as the US, Italy, and Brazil, leaders made racist statements blaming and degrading China and Chinese people for the virus. In the US, Europe, and Africa, there have been violent attacks against Asian people. One novel development that we will watch going forward is the push to include the right to care in the UN's list of recognized international human rights. The Global Alliance for Care, co-convened by UN Women and Mexico's National Institute of Women, argues that the pandemic has provided a chance to strengthen care policies and systems. The Alliance details 6 core commitments to reshape the care agenda and aims to incorporate a human rights perspective to all aspects of care. It is also worth noting that Canada's feminist economic recovery plan for the pandemic includes a big focus on the care infrastructure in the country. During the early days of the pandemic, countries had few tools to contain the spread of the virus. With no treatment available, infection prevention was critical, and strategies relied heavily on effective contact tracing. Data show that 51% of countries covered by the Global Monitor deployed a CTA over the course of the pandemic, with the highest proportion in the Middle East and the lowest proportion in Africa. By January of 2021, in fact, there were 49 CTAs in 48 different countries. South Korea offers a good example of how a country can mitigate the risks of collecting and centrally storing sensitive personal data. South Korea recorded intimate data on COVID-19 cases, including detailed information on residents' movements. This data was stored on the country's COVID-19 smart management system, which allowed health authorities to quickly respond to breakouts. This approach enjoyed widespread public support, primarily because of the cybersecurity measures put in place to protect the system and to data protection regulations, which circumscribe data access to a limited number of epidemiological investigators and which require the deletion of personal data after 14 days. So what lessons does the COVID-19 experience have for us? Reviewing the development and penetration of CTAs around the world, it's hard to escape the importance of trust. CTA trustworthiness is shaped by a number of factors, but important steps we need to build on are ensuring that apps effectively preserve privacy and putting in place robust data protection laws. The low level of trust that many citizens have in their governments and the widespread concerns about CTA mission creep mean that there must be policies and law that clearly define who controls the data, who can access the data, and how long that data can be stored. At the start of the pandemic, few could have predicted that as of March 2022, more than 5 billion people, or 66% of the world's population, would have received at least one dose of the vaccine, while 59% would be fully vaccinated with 2 doses. Vaccines were developed in record time, but the fact that they were developed at quote-unquote warp speed in some countries doesn't mean that access and availability followed the same trajectory. 2 key challenges can be identified. First, vaccine resistance and hesitancy, which have long been a problem. And 2, the stunning number of people who received at least 1 dose hides the unequal distribution of those vaccines. Limited production, complex supply chains, scarce resources for healthcare spending in low-income countries, limited state capacity, intellectual property measures, and vaccine hoarding by high-income countries have contributed to this. Therefore, while enough vaccinations were produced in 2021 to cover 70% of the global population, most were reserved for wealthy countries. As of March 2022, 66% of the world's population has received at least 1 dose. This, in absolute terms, is very close to the WHO's target of vaccinating 70% of the population of every country by 2022. However, access and distribution have been very unequal. As we reflect on how we have fared in responding to the pandemic and plan to be more prepared for future such scenarios, much will depend on how innovative and responsive recovery strategies are. This is a moment to think about how to do better at putting the disadvantaged groups in our societies at the front and center of recovery efforts and integrating their needs more systematically into all our institutions. It is also a moment to think seriously about the broken bonds of trust at all levels, not only because this will be key to weathering future crises, but because it is key to bolstering the strength of democratic institutions, something the world needs now more than ever. The good news is that the mechanisms for dialogue and accountability that are at the heart of democracies are perfectly suited for this work that goes into rebuilding trust. Building back better is possible, but it means being responsive and accountable to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sima. We had a rather comprehensive view with Staffan's presentation on the state of democracy and your zooming into the impact of the pandemic on democracy and human rights. Before giving the floor to our discussant, who is Ulrika Moder, Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Bureau of External Relations and Advocacy at UNDP, I want to tell to participants that they may post in the chat function on the WebEx platform questions or that they would like to pose to the panelists or the discussant. So there were many references to the importance of trust in institutions. We know how important trust is in our common agenda set by the Secretary General of the United Nations, and how important is the work of UNDP in building trust in democratic institutions and processes. So perhaps, Ulrika, you may get back to us with some comments on this volume of data that were being presented today. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Massimo, and thank you, International IDEA and V-Dem. And of course, the very gloomy picture that's being portrayed here, the facts and also the trends that are presented are very important, I think, to the UN as we try to also take information to the ground with regards to the global overview, but also, of course, build information from the ground. And UNDP, you would know, is present with programs with good governance and rule of law and human rights at the heart in 130 member states. And it is, of course, interesting to see these trends across the world in all of the world's regions. And this tells us, of course, that this should definitely be part of the common agenda, as you say, that the Secretary General has laid out. And UNDP has just recently endorsed strategic plan where we also have a rights-based approach and the work that we could provide governments, societies in relation to governance systems put forward at the center of our strategic plan. We have, of course, also, as we had the assignment by the Secretary General to accompany countries throughout COVID, seen many of these trends. So we have also, throughout the past years, issued a number of reports that show what we have also been told today with regards to disinformation as one aspect, how legislation imposed has also made hindrances with regards to basic and fundamental rights. And we have also seen the relationship in the broader system of accountability, because the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic have been so severe in many countries. So we believe that the discussions that we need to have on the basis of the material that you put forward here today also needs to relate also, as was alluded to the socioeconomic situation that countries and Charlotta alluded to this in the very beginning, are also in and will continue to be in, because what we see now is not a perfect storm, but perhaps a hurricane, because also the socioeconomic consequences of the pandemic are accompanied also by a looming debt crisis, and now also we see the consequences in relation and the ripple effects in relation to the war against Ukraine. So when we speak about systems of accountability, and I was happy that we could also end on a bit of a happy note, that there are also answers to all these questions and problems that have been laid out here today. UNDP traditionally, of course, works to strengthen systems of accountability with elections at the heart of it. In average, I mean, throughout the past decades, UNDP has been supporting elections every second week. But it's not only election as such, but really going deep into the electoral process and supporting the institutions that needs to be there to uphold this. But beyond these systems of accountability and looking at what's happening with regards to information societies and how we need to make sure that citizens can be informed in a new and different way, and where we also use UNDP's new ways of working with digital infrastructure in our governance work, we also need to look at the broader systems of accountability, bringing in other actors. We believe, and this is also what we put forward in our strategic plan, that local governance is key, a key solution that we need to look closer into, and that we need to work with a broad range of actors in society, as the SDGs also have invited to be part of the solution. We believe that there are some key hindrances that perhaps have not been mentioned here today, and that is also the concerning and sometimes also increasing levels of corruption that needs to be addressed in relation to strengthen the levels of trust in society. So information and information that can reach citizens in a trustworthy way is key. Of course, freedom of media is part of that, but also looking at new information societies and the structure of information. Looking at corruption, looking at local governance. These are some of the issues that we have seen that are really important to recreate the trust. Because at the end of the day, and I think it was mentioned also, I mean, social cohesion is something that many countries are really concerned about. And perhaps also to end on somewhat a positive note, while we see these really concerning trends, throughout the past years, UNDP has had an increasing level of demands with regards to support to governance and governance systems. And this tells us that the also levels of social unrest, the levels of the decrease of trust also is a concern in many different countries across the world. And we really also appreciate the trust that many countries have in UNDP to see if there are solutions, and if we step by step can start to roll back also these concerning trends that have been presented here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. And the points you're making about corruption and local governance are extremely important. I'm aware that V-Dem's framework takes into account corruption. It is also a key element in the framework used by International IDEA. So yes, it is very, very important. Also, the element of acting at the local level, as you said, with the rights-based approach is very, very important. And we have seen through the analysis carried out and presented by CIMA on the impact of COVID-19 on democracy and human rights, that dynamics at the local level have also been particularly important. Some of the burden of the implementation of the policies actually fell on the shoulders of our local governments, and the learning curve that we have seen from the various graphs had also to do with the capacity of national governments to understand and better react by including also local structures, local governance structures into these. Let me now turn to the chat, and I have a question that comes from Shazia Rafi. I'll read it. As democracy faces new challenges in both established and transitional democracies, the UN's voice in support of the principles of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has become even more important. And this moral leadership role of the UN Secretary General is crucial, as democracy has no international legal enforcement system, while the human rights body's penalty system is activated only after mass atrocities have taken place. How can we operationalize that? Well, that is a question clearly on the role of the UN, but perhaps also Staffan and Sima may address it. Who wants to start? Operationalization of obligations that are not actually accepted in a global normative framework, as it is the case in the human rights framework. Staffan?
I think, and it's very gratifying to get this question from Shazia Rafi, who was the Secretary General of PGA, Parliamentarians for Global Action, when I worked for them in Ghana some decades ago. I think we fail to recognize often that there is a very broad overlap between human rights and democratic rights. And we have the human rights enshrined in the UN Charter, and many of those are the rights that are definitional also for democracy. So it's sort of almost a given that democracies and increasing democratic governance is also good for human rights. And when you monitor human rights, you also monitor, to a large extent, democratic rights. So I think that connection is something that we should discuss and recognize much more.
Thank you very much, Staffan. I have another question from the audience. This is addressed to Sima from Christian Candler Rodriguez. He is asking, I would like to ask, on the basis of this extensive report, if you would like to share reflections on how to distinguish between good or necessary restrictions during the pandemic from excessive restrictions that led to weakening the general freedoms in a country. Well, in fact, Sima, you refer to cases of restrictions in 98% of the countries in the world. So they were rather generalized. So how would you characterize the good or necessary from the excessive restrictions?
So the way that we did it in our research was that a development was considered, quote, concerning when it violated democratic benchmarks in the sense that it was disproportionate, unnecessary, illegal, or indefinite. So if restrictions were implemented in the context of the law, were time-bound, and were proportionate to the risk that they were addressing, we considered them justified. But of course, the issue of how to measure proportionality is there's no consensus around that. So I think that remains an open question.
So in other words, the importance of the context is paramount, but definitely there are some criteria to define what are the parameters for assessing the quality of restrictions and their constitutionality with respect to a democratic framework. Okay, so we had these questions from the floor. I have seen another one from Alessandro Motter from the Interparliamentary Union. Perhaps what needs to be considered in looking at the deep causes of citizen distrust of government is the relationship between governments and markets, and how the former have seized the power to the latter, leaving people alone fending for themselves and feeling isolated from each other. In the face of market forces made stronger by hyper-globalization and financialization, governments are powerless to deliver to the people. And the people in turn do not look at government as the solution. We need to break this underlying pattern as a condition to democratic reforms. Well, this is not really a question, it's a comment. And I think it is very relevant also to what Ulrika envisioned in the strategy of UNDP. No, I think it has to do with the quality of state responses beside also the quality of democratic institutions. It has to do also, I think, with Staffan's picture in the second part of his presentation when he made the case for democracy. And I think it is relevant also to Sima's overview of the recovery, of how we have learned from the first responses and how can we do better in terms of the recovery in the long term. Any of the discussants or the panelists want to comment on these? Yes, Sima.
There's been some really excellent scholarship on this question, and I think that one article comes to mind that was in the Journal of Democracy recently about the rise of populism and how the liberal sort of left could do well to be more empathetic to the concerns that many people in post-communist countries had who did not enjoy the economic benefits of what was, the reality did not match the promise. And so when analyzing the rise of populism, this author argued that you should be more empathetic, and when you're arguing for more liberal democracy, you need to keep those valid concerns of people in mind and address them. But even in the human rights scholarship, there's a lot that has been said about the state's, how the state's authority has kind of been overtaken by the market, and how this means that states have less power overall to protect their citizens, and how this is vilified. How pushback against this is vilified. And so I really support the comment that was made, and I think that could be a topic of a whole other session.
Mhm.
Yes.
And if
Yes, Ulrika.
No, I was just also about to say that, I mean, something that we have not mentioned are also the parallel trends that we see to this, and it would be interesting also to discuss with regards to increasing inequalities, and it relates also to what Sima said. We have, in our human development report a couple of years ago, actually ahead the pandemic, pointed at access to information, but also digital infrastructure and digital means as one possible key driver of increasing inequalities that can really also put all of what we're discussing here in danger. So investments in once again digital democratic governance systems that can lay the ground for interaction and accountability with different actors in society, I think are a key solution to this. But of course, much more to be discussed in relation to this question. I just wanted also to comment on the first question. I think what Staffan said with regards to democratic governance as a driver for economic growth and human development is, of course, a very good argument for a development actor to use as we try to also see how we can support countries on a road that opens up accountability structures that work better for the country, both for democracy or for a road towards more inclusive ways of working that could lead to democracy, but also in relation to economic development and human development and the sustainable development goals overall. So those arguments are, of course, very important to any development actor that wants to convince any government in any country across the world.
Thank you very much, Ulrika. Also, Staffan wanted to reply to the second question. Yes, Staffan?
Thank you, and thanks for the reflection. I think, hey, we don't have the scientific answers yet, but as Sima also indicated, there is a growing body of research now on the role of inequality and marketization and the withdrawal of the state from key areas that is pointing in certain directions. And this is also not too far from intuition, right? This started with Reaganomics and Thatcherism in the late 70s, early 80s, and been ongoing since. And then was rolled out with the Washington Consensus to the rest of the world with structural adjustment programs. Maybe much of that was needed, okay, but it's gone very far. And what's happened sort of in just a 1 minute here, I'm looking at the clock, Massimo, and I know you want to close at 10. But basically what is done is putting a lot more responsibility on individuals for everything that has to do with how your life goes and your kids' lives goes and so on. With marketization, privatization, and then enormous rise in inequality, as we know, relative inequality, if nothing else, to extreme levels now. And at the same time, with the same sort of theory behind it, the state has withdrawn from a number of policy areas. So the politicians are no longer responsible, but the technocrats or the market. And that makes people more exposed and therefore more potentially afraid. And afraid people in groups is a very dangerous political force. We know that from the 1930s. Okay? So I think this is an area we have to look much more into and do much more research on to get the really hard answers.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. We know it not only from the 1930s, but we know it also from the global financial crisis, which is much more recent. And that is something that I would like to use to close, to wrap up this event. We have data, we have analysis, good policy relevant analysis. Policymakers should take that analysis into account. It is my impression that the policy community is slow in learning from experience. And we cannot compare, of course, the magnitude of the global crisis brought about by pandemic and the one that we experienced in 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis. But it is possible to see that there are elements in common in terms of the type of reaction, especially with this last conversation on the role of the state and the quality of policies in terms of impacting on huge inequalities. And we have learned from the analysis presented by V-Dem and by International IDEA that polarization is one of the possible outcomes of crises that exacerbate already existing processes of erosion of democratic institutions. So I think that we have heard a message. It is up to policymakers now to act on the basis of those indications. I very much thank all the participants in this event. Let me thank, first of all, the ambassador from the Permanent Mission of Sweden, Charlotta Schleiter. Thank you very much for co-hosting this event with International IDEA. Professor Staffan Lindberg, Dr. Seema Shah, and Ulrika Moder from UNDP. Thank you very much, and thank you for also the support that we received from the New York office of International IDEA, Amanda Surek. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Staffan?